And now for the decade of 1830. What happened during the decade of 1830? Well, in terms of technological advancements, this was a decade when companies first started producing trains and building steam-powered locomotives and laying down train tracks, and the use of trains becomes widespread. This picture here, I believe, is a locomotive built by the Matthias Baldwin Company, which I think is the first company that started manufacturing steam-powered locomotives in the United States. And this addresses that problem of transportation. Recall before I mentioned that transportation over land prior to this point was very, very difficult. And this takes one small step towards making transportation a little bit easier in the United States. This is also a time when something called penny papers first started getting published and sold. I believe the first penny papers were sold in New York. And these penny papers, in some ways, might be kind of like a precursor to a modern-day newspaper. Now, prior to this time, there were newspapers, but previous newspapers were mostly political. They were papers where people would advocate for a particular political position. And the previous papers tended to be expensive, and they tended to have a relatively low circulation. In contrast, these penny papers were cheap. As the name implies, they were only a penny, and these penny papers reported on sensational and scandalous stories, stories of things like murder and rape and fires, things that drew people's interest, so they had a relatively high circulation. Now, unfortunately, these papers also very often connected crime with black people, so these papers have a racist component as well. They were promoting racist ideas. And another racist thing that became popular at this time was minstrel shows. So minstrel shows were the shows where white men would dress in blackface and imitate black people, and they would do racist skits and songs and dances, and they would portray black people as being stupid, and this was a type of entertainment that people found funny and enjoyable at this time in history. Now, the decade of 1830 could be considered the decade of Andrew Jackson. He was president from 1829 to 1837, so he was president for a good part of this decade. And Andrew Jackson was probably somewhat of a different type of president from what the United States had had prior to this point. Recall that Andrew Jackson was a war hero from the War of 1812. He was the general that defended the city of New Orleans when the British were attacking, although it was actually after the war was over, but the British were attacking New Orleans, and Jackson was the war hero that defended the city. As a military commander, he also led several battles against Native American nations. Sometimes he would use Native American groups as allies to help him fight battles against other Native American groups. And then sometimes he would turn on those Native Americans and take their land when he had the power to do so. And Andrew Jackson was from the South, and he ascribed the idea that men needed to defend their honor. And so he was part of that dueling culture, and throughout his life he fought several duels. In one duel, he killed a man. He also carried a bullet in his shoulder from another duel that he fought, and that bullet remained in his shoulder for his entire life and often caused him some deal of pain. There's one story that when he was president, there was a man that tweaked his nose, which I'm not sure exactly what that meant, but some man tweaked his nose, and Andrew Jackson, in response, tried to beat the man with his cane, and he had to be restrained so he didn't severely beat the man that tweaked his nose. Now, Andrew Jackson was part of what could be called a populist movement. Jackson campaigned against the old elitist system, the previous system where the idea was that common people were supposed to vote for an elite group of men who would then choose the president. And Andrew Jackson ran a campaign that people should vote directly for him. And he was a war hero, he was from the South, and he supported white male supremacy, and voters, who were all white men at the time, liked him. So he won, and he could probably be described as the first populist president. Now, in this process, he started a brand new political party, and that political party was the Democrats, and that's the same Democratic political party that we still have today. Although, as we will see, the platform of Andrew Jackson is probably very different from today's Democratic Party. In general, Andrew Jackson's platform could be described as a platform of white male supremacy. And throughout his presidency, he focused on two key agenda items. One of those was Indian removal. In other words, he wanted to remove Native Americans from their lands. By whatever means possible, using military force if necessary, he wanted to remove Native Americans from lands so that white settlers could move in. Today, we might call that type of plan ethnic cleansing. So, for example, he gave southern states in Georgia permission to disregard previous treaties they had made with Native Americans. He said that, well, the United States might have made treaties with Native Americans, giving them permission to live on certain land, but Georgia didn't make that treaty with the Native Americans. So if Georgia as a state wants to disregard that treaty and use violence to remove the Native Americans from that land, well, that's perfectly fine with me. So he did several things to promote Indian removal. He was also strongly pro-slavery, and he did things to expand slavery in the United States. So, for example, one thing is that he nominated and put in place several Supreme Court justices that were strongly pro-slavery, and that influenced the course of legal decisions over the next several decades. An important event that took place in the decade of 1830 was the Trail of Tears. So now the Native American people had been using different tactics for dealing with white people encroaching on their land. Sometimes they fought, and sometimes they assimilated white culture. And the Cherokee had been following a strategy of assimilating white culture rather than fighting. So white people referred to the Cherokee as one of the 5 civilized tribes. The Cherokee lived in Georgia. They lived on land that was allotted to them by a previous treaty with the United States. But in 1830, Andrew Jackson gained passage of a law called the Indian Removal Act. And this authorized the government to start taking steps to remove the Cherokee and other Native Americans from land in the southeast part of the United States. The plan was to ask Native American nations to leave their land and move to Oklahoma, to offer them some money, and to remove federal protection from white people wanting to take their land by force, so that if white people used violence against Native Americans, the Native Americans really couldn't retaliate and the U.S. government would not protect them. Now, a handful of leaders within the Cherokee community, a small number of leaders, they saw where this was going and they realized that sooner or later they're going to be removed by force no matter what. So this group of leaders, they were persuaded to move to Oklahoma and sign a treaty giving all the Cherokee land to the United States. Now, importantly, the authority of these Cherokee leaders to sign this treaty was merely presumed by the United States government. It wasn't something that was actually granted by the Cherokee people, and the Cherokee people viewed them as traitors. Nevertheless, this treaty was then used as justification for forcibly removing all the Cherokee from the land. So, in the Cherokee Nation, teams of white soldiers from the United States, they went from house to house, they removed the occupants, and they moved the Cherokee, they rounded them up, and they locked all the Cherokee into a system of stockades. And in the meantime, the Cherokee, their people, the property was looted, and their homes were taken over by white people. Then, after being held in stockades for a few months, they were forced to march to Oklahoma. It was a very long march. It would have been over 1,000 miles to go from Georgia to Oklahoma. And they started in the fall, it went to the winter, and it was actually a very harsh winter. So given harsh winter conditions, a lack of supplies, the spread of disease, a lot of the disease was caused by the fact that they had been grouped together in terrible conditions in the stockades prior to the march. And so as a result of all these things, many people died along the way. And so the march from Georgia to Oklahoma is sometimes called the Trail of Tears. And one estimate is that maybe about 5,000 Cherokee people died along this march. Another thing that occurred during the decade of 1830 is that slavery, which was already a terrible thing, became even harsher. So as the United States gained new southern territory, partly by taking land from Native Americans and also from the Louisiana Purchase, cotton plantations expanded west. Cotton plantations moved into Georgia and then eventually into land around the Mississippi River. And as I mentioned before, the world had a high demand for cotton. Cotton grew well in the South, and it could be produced very cheaply using slave labor. And the United States became the top supplier of cotton in the world. And this was a primary factor that was actually driving very high economic growth in the United States at this time. Southern plantation owners became wealthy, and people in the North also benefited from the economic growth and access to cheap cotton. So white people financially benefited from the situation. So what this meant, though, is that initially most of the slaves were in the eastern part of the United States, the Southeast, and these slaves had to be moved west to where the new cotton plantations were, into Georgia and then eventually on into the Mississippi area. So slaves in eastern states had to be sold and moved west. Slaves were like a commodity. They were sold to pay off debts. They were used as collateral on loans to buy more slaves and expand plantations. And so slaves were sold and moved west. Now, of course, the selling of slaves caused family separations. This meant that children and babies were separated from parents, wives were separated from husbands. So selling of slaves, one of the key things that involves is it means that families are being torn apart, babies are being taken from mothers, never to be seen by their family members again. One of the ways that slaves were sometimes transported west was through a coffle. And a coffle is simply a line of slaves that are chained or tied together, all forced to march to their destination. So men were chained in a line. Sometimes they had iron collars around their necks or chains on their ankles. Women were tied more often with ropes. And when they were tied together or chained together like this, that meant that the entire coffle, they had to sleep, eat, eliminate bodily waste, all this stuff they had to do while chained together. And white men on horses then would force the coffle to march to their destination. Again, sometimes maybe over 1,000 miles or something, a very long march it could be. Now, another thing that's notable, that was really making slavery especially harsh here, is that white people were discovering new methods of torture to increase cotton productivity. So one of the key punishments that was used was whipping. Slaves were whipped if they didn't satisfy the demands of white people. Note that a feature of an industrial revolution, and we can talk about how the industry was growing around this time in history, and one feature of an industrial revolution is that people invented techniques that made production more efficient, meaning that the same number of people working the same length of time produced more. And with slavery, plantation owners invented new techniques in the use of torture to increase productivity of slaves. So here's how it would work. A slave would pick cotton from sunrise to sunset, and at the end of the day, the slave's cotton would be weighed. The overseer had a ledger indicating how much cotton each slave was capable of picking. If a slave did not pick his or her allotted weight, the slave was whipped, and this whipping was terrible. It left deep, bloody gashes in the skin. Sometimes it made people pass out. They would vomit. They would shake. So whipping was a terrible, painful punishment. Now, if a slave picked more than his or her allotted weight, the overseer went, "Aha, I know you can pick more now," and the overseer would increase the slave's required amount. So over the span of 2 decades, and that's what's shown on the chart you're looking at here, shows you how the average amount of cotton picked by one slave in one day increased from almost 50 pounds to over 100 pounds. In other words, over the span of a few decades, it more than doubled. And this was not due to any no innovations in equipment or techniques for picking cotton. It was due to innovations in the use of torture to extract more work out of slaves. After slavery ended, when workers had to be paid for picking cotton, their level of worker efficiency never reached these high levels. So torture turned out to be a very efficient way of extracting a lot of work out of slaves.
Tremble with fear, the Georgia man coming, rips from a family song to be sold, coffles and chains and collars of iron. Now will we hear these words to be told? All this remembrance of the breaking of...
Now, while slavery was becoming harsher in the South, in the North, there was a new beginning for a very small anti-slavery movement. Specifically, the American Anti-Slavery Society was founded. Many members were inspired by religion. Recall when I talked about the Second Great Awakening, how there were Bible societies, and some of these Bible societies focused on the issue of abolition. Notably, many members of the American Anti-Slavery Society, they included both black people and white people. Now, this was not a large group. It tended to be a very small group. And even though they were in the North, they were often attacked or threatened with violence. And also, one thing to note about the abolitionist movement, and this is a theme we'll see throughout our discussions of the abolitionist movement, is that they tended to adopt an assimilationist racist point of view. So the assimilationist point of view is the one that views black people and white people as not currently being equal, but potentially equal to each other at some point in the future. So if you look at the materials produced by the American Anti-Slavery Society, on one hand, we look and say, well, this is very good because they're abolitionist. On the other hand, they do tend to portray black people as relatively weak and helpless as compared to white people. So they portrayed slaves as being helpless. Interestingly, they also frequently portrayed slaves as being especially religious, but they portrayed slaves as being passive and needing salvation from white people. And you can kind of see that in this picture here, which is from one of their publications of a slave who's kneeling down, looking up, and almost kind of in a begging type of pose with chains on his wrists. So it portrays that slave in a rather helpless position. It might elicit sympathy from white people, but it also portrays a message that the black people need salvation from white people and that the black people are weaker and the white people are the strong saviors that need to come in and save the day. Notably, one of the very first things the American Anti-Slavery Society did was to try to send anti-slavery tracts to people in the South. They thought that, well, maybe if we just explain why slavery is such a bad thing and mail our logic and our reasoning, mail it to people in the South, they will read that and they will understand, oh, this really is bad to have slavery, and they will change their ways. That was probably a rather naive thing to think, but they tried it. But what happened is that Andrew Jackson, recall he was a very pro-slavery president, he told the southern states to simply dispose the mail sent from northern anti-slavery organizations. So he told the U.S. Post Office, simply dispose of these letters. Now, what happened there was actually a Supreme Court case, and then the Supreme Court came in and they ruled that, well, no, the post office can't dispose of the mail, they have to deliver it. So they went to a backup plan, and the backup plan was, okay, we'll deliver these anti-slavery tracts to the southern post offices, and then the post office will post a public list. And if you want to receive your anti-slavery tract, you just come down and put your name on this public list so everyone can see, and then we will deliver your tract to you. Or if you don't want the tract, just don't do anything, and we'll understand that you don't want it. And of course, no one signed up to receive their tracts, and so for the most part, they were not delivered. One of the founding members of the American Anti-Slavery Society was William Lloyd Garrison. And William Lloyd Garrison might be the most famous white abolitionist prior to the Civil War. So in addition to founding the American Anti-Slavery Society, his key role was that he ran a newspaper. His newspaper was called The Liberator, and it was an abolitionist anti-slavery newspaper. And the things that he published called for immediate emancipation. So where some people were against slavery and said, yeah, we're against slavery, but we need to have a plan to end it gradually, Garrison said, no, slavery is so terrible, we need to end it now. The end of slavery needs to be immediate. And we can look at Garrison and get a sense as to how the assimilationist, racist ideas worked its way into the abolitionist movement. So Garrison treated free black people as equals. He socialized with black people and generally treated them as equals. But he thought that slaves would need education to gain political equality. And note, many free black people would have concurred with this. Many black people who were free thought that slaves weren't really their equals, which shows you that you don't have to be white to have racist ideas. So to give you a sense of this, down at the bottom of this page here, I show you some of the things that Garrison wrote. So he said that slavery's effects, the effects of slavery, is that it cripples their intellects, darkens their minds, debases their moral nature, obliterates all traces of their relationship to mankind. Now, on one hand, this is arguing for why slavery is so terrible. But on the other hand, if you have a crippled intellect and a darkened mind and a debased moral nature, that kind of makes you somewhat less than human, or at least less than a superior white person in some ways. So we can see how this abolitionist movement, on the one hand, was doing a good thing. They were against slavery. But on the other hand, there was still this assimilationist, racist viewpoint that was kind of steeped throughout their thinking. And now let's pick up our story about Henry James and the James family. If you recall, Henry James will eventually become the father of William James, who will go on to become the first psychologist in the United States. And where we left off last time, Henry James, as a child and adolescent, he drank alcohol quite a bit, and he also had that accident that left him with a prosthetic leg. Now, throughout his life, Henry James was interested in, well, maybe rather idiosyncratic religious ideas. He was always shifting from one idea to another, but his ideas were always relatively unorthodox. But in the 1830s, he decided he wanted to go to Princeton Theological Seminary. And so he started attending Princeton. And there he became interested in a lot of different ideas. One thing he became interested in was a group called the Sandemanians, who thought that in the Bible there was no basis for pastoral authority. So they wanted to go back to a kind of primitive Christianity where pastors had no authority. And a general theme throughout Henry James' life is that he really didn't like churches, he didn't like clergy, and he didn't like the liturgy that they read in churches. So he was kind of an unorthodox religious person. So while he was attending Princeton, he met the Walsh family. And the Walsh family, there was a mother, Elizabeth Walsh, and she was a widow, and she had two daughters, Mary and Catherine. And the daughters were in their 20s, and they were single, which at this point in history, to be 20s and single, that was considered rather old to be unmarried in your 20s, because at that point you're at risk of becoming a spinster, and which was considered not a good thing in this culture. Now, the Walsh family, they were actually a fairly wealthy family. The father of the family had died many years earlier, but he had a lot of money in the family, was fairly wealthy. They were devout Presbyterians. I recall that in the North, the Presbyterians was one of the denominations that grew quite a bit during the Second Great Awakening. And the sisters followed the standard social norms for women of the time. They stayed indoors. They received visitors at their home. They sewed, and they volunteered at the church. And Henry came visiting both sisters. And eventually, so he visited both sisters, but eventually he married Mary. Although, interestingly, Catherine lived with her family for most of their lives. So actually, most of their lives, it was actually Henry married to Mary, but Catherine lived with the family for most of the family's existence. I kind of think that Henry's connection to Princeton may have misled the Walsh family at first, because they were devout, kind of traditional, straightforward Presbyterians, and so he was attending seminary, presumably being trained to become a pastor, And so they might have thought, oh, this sounds like a nice, upright type of person. But then later they realized, oh, his ideas are rather unorthodox. And actually, when Henry and Mary got married, which I have their picture on this page here, although that's when they were much, much older. I don't have any pictures when they were younger. But when they were married, they got married at the Walsh's home rather than being married in a church, which also fits with Henry's rather unorthodox anti-church types of viewpoints. Now, without looking ahead, I wonder if you could answer this question. What event occurring during the decade of 1830 was one of the most important events in the history of psychology? Or maybe I should say, according to me, was one of the most important events in the history of psychology. Can you guess what event I'm thinking of? Well, I am thinking of Charles Darwin and his voyage on the HMS Beagle around the world that led Darwin to his theory of evolution. So Darwin, he was from England, and he was, well, another white male from a wealthy family. His dad was a highly paid physician, and his mom was from the Wedgwood family, which was a very prominent family in England. And so they could afford to have paintings made of their children. And so here we have a painting of Darwin when he was 7 years old. Eventually he went to medical school, but he dropped out. And then he got a bachelor's degree, although he was kind of at the bottom of his class. But Darwin became interested in becoming a naturalist, and a naturalist was kind of the common type of scientist at this time in history. A naturalist was someone who made careful observations of plants and animals and geological formations, and this was kind of the popular science of the time. Darwin spent a lot of time with a man named John Stevens Henslow, who was a botanist and someone who encouraged Darwin's interest in naturalism. So in 1831, Darwin was given an opportunity to be the naturalist on board the HMS Beagle. So this was actually going to be essentially a military expedition mapping coastlines around the world. But as part of this expedition, they had a spot on their boat for a naturalist. It was an unpaid position for one naturalist to join the expedition and tag along. And Darwin got that position to be the naturalist on board the HMS Beagle. And the pictures you're looking at are pictures of the HMS Beagle, so you can get a sense of what that boat looked like. So in 1831, they began their voyage. They went essentially around the world. This map is showing the path that expedition took, going around the world, mapping coastlines. One of the most notable parts of that journey for Darwin was visiting the Galapagos Islands, which are right here. I'll kind of circle that in the Pacific Ocean over there, the Galapagos Islands. Because and looking at the Galapagos Islands, Darwin observed things like tortoises and finches that lived on those islands. In fact, I think I have a picture here. Let's see, here's a tortoise on one of the Galapagos Islands there. So that's a tortoise, and let's see, I think I got some finches. There we go, finches. I'm not sure where those finches are from. Those are pictures of finches. So Darwin was observing tortoises and finches on the Galapagos Islands and noticed how different islands, that the animals were different on different islands. And that is one of the key things that eventually led him to his theory of evolution. So he returns from his voyage, and actually he publishes a book. It wasn't a book about evolution. It was a book just describing his expedition and the types of animals that he discovered along the way. But that book actually made him rather famous. It sold well and made him somewhat famous. 1839, he marries Emma Wedgwood, who became Emma Darwin, pictured here. And by the end of the decade, by 1840, he had arrived at his theory of natural selection. So essentially, at the beginning of this decade, when he left on his voyage, he actually firmly believed in a 7-day creation story from the Bible. He believed that the world was created in 7 days. And by the end of this decade, he had arrived at this theory of evolution. And eventually, he would become probably agnostic in his religious beliefs eventually. Now, although by the end of this decade he'd arrived at his theory of natural selection, he did not yet publish it. He actually kept it to himself for several years. A lot of people wonder why that is that he didn't publish it. So at the end of the 1830s, Darwin had made his voyage on the Beagle. He arrived at his theory of natural selection, but at this point he was just keeping it to himself. He had not published it yet. Now let's leave Darwin in England and go over to the area of those German states that were formed after the wars with Napoleon. And I want to talk about this person here, Ernst Weber. And Weber lived in the area of those German states. He did a lot of his work in the city of Leipzig. And he started a tradition of research that could be called German psychophysics. So what was German psychophysics all about? So Weber was interested in human sensation, and specifically he wanted to understand at what point can people detect a difference between two levels of a stimuli. So for example, if you're shown a color and then we change that color slightly, how much do we have to change the color before you can detect that the color's different? Or if someone listens to a tone, how much does the tone have to change in pitch before someone will recognize that it's a different tone? And the key thing is he came up with a mathematical formula to describe people's ability to detect differences between two levels of a stimulus. So he was looking at mathematical formulas to describe sensation. His formula is this right here. Delta R divided by R equals K, where R is the original value of a stimulus, like say the original pitch of a tone. Delta R is how much that stimulus changes, so like how much the tone changes, and then K is a constant. And he thought that this ratio here was different for different types of sensations. So for example, he thought this ratio was 1/60th for vision and 1/13th for pain, 1/10th for tones, and 1/4 for smell. Now, exactly what this formula is might not be quite so as important. The important thing is that he came up with a mathematical formula and that he was trying to use a mathematical formula to understand human sensation. And this is actually a line of research that will lead fairly directly, eventually, to psychology. Now, you might be wondering, how does this lead to psychology? Well, eventually, hang on to the story and we'll see how this eventually leads to psychology. So I mentioned that our story will often involve psychological ideas that started off in Europe and then were later imported to the United States. And during the decade of 1830 was a time when, indeed, ideas from Europe got imported to the United States. And one of those ideas was the idea of mesmerism. Recall that in France, Anton Mesmer had his theory about animal magnetism and how magnets influence the body, and then later that led to him just thinking that I'd put people into a trance, and by putting people into a trance, that can heal them. And Charles Pouyen was in France, and he studied Mesmer's ideas in France, and then he brought those ideas to the United States. And in the 1830s, he came to the United States and gave lectures and demonstrations about mesmerism and made mesmerism popular in the United States. And he used this mesmerism, this idea of putting people into trances. At the time, they would have called it mesmerism or magnetism, or today we might call that same type of thing hypnotism. But he was using this process with the idea that would help people get in touch with their animal magnetism. Everyone has this animal magnetism that dwells inside yourself, and by getting in touch with your animal magnetism, you will find your true self, and you can improve yourself that way. He actually promoted the idea that illness was caused by improper thoughts, which in some ways could be similar to today's idea of cognitive psychology. In some ways, his idea was that health is a result of proper thinking. So anyway, he promoted this idea of mesmerism, and mesmerism became a popular thing in the United States. And you might go to see a mesmerist for help with all kinds of issues I have over here. Like you could go to a mesmerist. Mesmerist might provide healing for either maybe if you're feeling bad, like feeling depressed, or maybe you're experiencing back pain, all kinds of issues that you might go to a mesmerist for healing. Just for self-improvement, or to feel revitalized, for motivation in your life, gain an ability to solve problems. So in some ways, kind of all the things that today someone might go to see, say, a clinical psychologist for help on, at this point in time, they might go to see a mesmerist for help with these types of things. Here's a picture from around the same time showing a mesmerist engaging in the process. They had some unusual ideas about what was going on with this. It looks like this guy has some kind of beam shooting out of his eyes that's getting reflected by a mirror. It says on here, experiment in animal magnetism. And again, magnetism, mesmerism, and hypnotism is all essentially the same idea. And let's see, here I have actually an article from a newspaper around the same time about Po Yin's lecture, just to get a sense of how they viewed mesmerism at this point in history. It's kind of an interesting article to read here. So it says, so Boston Post, 1837, title, Animal Magnetism. Monsieur Po Yin is lecturing on animal magnetism at Medway. Miss Gleason, his attendant, advances rapidly in the science. On being put into a magnetic state a few days since, she examined the condition of several invalids, and by her power of looking into their stomachs when in that state, accurately described their several diseases and prescribed the proper remedies. This is too good a joke. The magnetic power not only enables the vision to penetrate flesh and bone, but imparts a thorough knowledge of the materia medica at the same time. So that gives you a sense of how people viewed this new mesmerism or hypnotism at this point in history. And another thing that was imported to the United States from Europe during the decade of 1830 was phrenology. So recall that Gall had developed phrenology in Europe, which was the idea that people have different traits, and different traits are localized in different brain areas, and that the larger the brain area, the stronger the trait, and that the brain area supposedly corresponds to the shape of the skull, and so that if you measure someone's skull carefully and assess the shape of the skull and the bumps or indentations on the skull, you can determine someone's personality. And Gall had his partner, Spurzheim, and Spurzheim was the one who was more wanted to sensationalize phrenology and wanted to promote it. And Spurzheim made a trip and visited Boston in 1832. So in 1832, Spurzheim visited Boston and lectured on phrenology, and that created a lot of interest in phrenology in the United States. And some people that were especially interested in phrenology were these people right here, Urson and Lorenzo Fowler and Samuel Wells. And they became big promoters of phrenology in the United States. They did a lot to market it and promote it in the United States. And the idea was that phrenology could be used for a lot of things. We could use phrenology to test people, like a pre-marriage counseling. You could go to a phrenologist and have your head read. I think that's where that expression would probably come from. You could go to a phrenologist and have an assessment to determine how well you might be compatible with a potential marriage partner. Employers might ask people to go to a phrenologist to get an assessment to determine if you're going to be a good employee, if you're going to be a good fit for their company. And more, maybe the biggest thing is that phrenology was used as a kind of self-improvement. You could go to a phrenologist and help you understand your strengths and weaknesses, and from that you could capitalize on your strengths and improve your weaknesses. So it was a type of self-improvement. So this type of self-improvement, you might go to a phrenologist or to a mesmerist, were both professionals you might seek at this point in history if you wanted to help with your life. So anyway, so that the Fowler brothers and Samuel Wells, they marketed phrenology, they lectured, they gave lectures on it. They started a journal, the American Phrenological Journal. They founded that in 1838, and they trained examiners in how to do phrenology. Let's see, and also they also sold supplies like charts and calipers, like here down here, calipers you'd use to measure someone's head with, and busts, like the one pictured over. This is actually a modern day replica of a phrenology bust that would have the head and have the different spots marked off of what traits go with what spot on the skull there, and manuals and cases and all kinds of supplies that they marketed. Eventually, they were in this business for quite a while. Jumping down a few decades, in 1859, they actually published something called the Self-Instructor Manual, which is used for phrenology. Actually, we can take a look at what that looked like here. Here we go. So the self-instruction manual was kind of like this. What you would do is you'd go to a phrenologist, and they would take all these measurements on your head, and then and for each measurement, it would be marked off in like they measure your amativeness or your parental love area or your friendship area or whatever, your combativeness area. They measure the area, and then they mark off the size from 7 very large to 2 small. So they mark off the size here. And so, for example, if you had a 5 for combativeness, they'd mark it off right here. And it says 98. And what that is, that says go to page 98 in their manual. So you get your scores here like that if you have there or maybe here. And each one of these tells you what page in the manual to go to. And so on page 98, it would tell you if you have a 5 for combativeness, here's what you're like, here's kind of your personality, and here's your strengths and weaknesses, and here's our advice to you for how you can either capitalize on your strengths or improve your weaknesses. So that was how this worked. You go to the phrenologist takes your readings, measures all these different areas, makes markings off in the manual, and then you have your manual that's marked off. You take that home with you, and then you can read about ways to improve yourself. And here's another picture from that same self-instructor manual illustrating the area for parental love. And this is showing here a picture here that here's a woman who has a big bump back here, and she's supposed to be the good mother. So I guess she has a large area in that motherly parental love area. And here is a woman here. She's kind of flat back here on that part of her head, and she is the unmotherly. So that was part of the idea of phrenology, that you look at the shape of someone's skull, and then I suppose if you're a husband wanting a wife that's a good mother, you might want someone that has a big bump back here. But if you don't care about the person's motherliness, maybe a flat bump back there is just fine. I guess that's how it went. So phrenology, and it started becoming a big thing in the United States during the decade of 1830.